Starting with the idea of cultural relativism, Berger and Luckman are saying, here's what we mean by subjective culture. Gregory Bateson is defining that in terms of systems theory. Along come Whorf and Sapir. Most of you recognize the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, which is the major connection of language and culture. So these other people really haven't been talking about language that much. But Whorf and Sapir are the people who are largely have established that language is one of the major enactments of culture. They're not the same thing, but it represents a kind of the major enactment of culture is through language. And most of you know, gave lots and lots of examples of how cultural differences are reflected in linguistic differences. Not determined by those linguistic differences, by the way. So you ought not to use the term linguistic determinism to refer to the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis. That was a term that was tagged on that by people who were arguing against it, saying, those people are saying that language determines culture, but look at the evidence here that language does not determine culture. And in fact, cross-cultural psychologists for a long time have seen it as their job to disprove the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis by pointing out that there are cultural differences that are not reflected in language. That people, for instance, can see the difference between blue and green even though they don't have words to distinguish blue and green, those kinds of studies. But Benjamin Lee Whorf and Edward Sapir never said that. What they were saying was language is the enactment of culture. They weren't saying it's the determinant of culture. So that's an argument that was tagged onto it. To counteract this, I actually took one of the original articles from Benjamin Lee Whorf called Linguistics as a Science and put it into my compendium which is called Basic Concepts of Intercultural Communication. I put this article in there precisely so people could go back and see what those people said in the first place. And they never said language determines culture. They said they're related. And I believe that in the context of this theoretical idea, they were saying it was related as a kind of enactment. Here comes Edward T. Hall, right about there. He's about halfway through. So he's building on the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, he's building on Bateson, he's building on the Berger and Luckman work, and what he's saying is, gee, it looks as if culture can be considered a kind of silent language. That's the title of his book. He brought in the idea of language and culture from Whorf-Sapir, also brought in the idea of culture as a system from Bateson, subjective culture, but added a very important dimension, and that was communication. He said, the real practical issue here is how somebody who comes from one of those relativistic cultural groups, A, B, C, or D, can communicate with somebody from one of those other ones. And the anthropologists basically had no answer to that. And still don't have very good answers, by the way, which is why interculturalists are not anthropologists. That anthropology is interested in describing culture, frequently in describing culture in its own contextual terms, frequently very, very well, but they're not very good at conceptualizing what happens between cultures. It's not their specialty because they're not operating with a sufficient amount of communication theory, really, to generate the idea of how meaning is created. So anthropologists, while they provide interculturalists with essential descriptions of culture, in fact themselves do not generate the theories of how people cross those cultures and create meaning. So anyway, Edward T. Hall brought that question in his work, because he was working largely with business people who wanted to know how to get along in another cultural context. So he was trying to teach them anthropology. And they said, we don't need this. We need to know how to communicate in this other culture. They didn't see the obvious connection, and in fact there really isn't one, that understanding a society or understanding a culture in anthropological terms makes you a good communicator in that context. And in fact, Hall's conclusion was, it doesn't. And you got to do something else. And what he did was to create basically the initial system of that something else, which are the so-called constructed etic categories that allow us to make comparisons and thus to adapt our behavior. More on that in a minute. George Kelly comes along. He's the guy, he's a psychologist, but he said, here's what it means to have experience. He's the one who famously said, experience is not a function of being in the vicinity of events when they occur. Rather, it is a function of how you construe those events, which has become the mainstay of Roberto's and my work in international exchange for years and years and years, which is just because you place somebody into another cultural context doesn't mean that they are having an intercultural experience. They're in a cross-cultural situation, but they're not necessarily engaged in intercultural learning. And as we now know from recent studies, unless you make an intervention, and the intervention is basically to teach them what Edward T. Hall originally formulated, which is, here's how to go about making sense of things cross-culturally. And if you make that intervention, then people do learn from being placed in another cultural context, but not necessarily automatically. So anyway, George Kelly defined that. Irving Goffman, another sociologist, has added to this notion through symbolic interactionism. Dean Barnlin and John Condon, brought in the idea of communication theory. Dean Barnlin is my teacher as well as Jack Condon's. Condon wrote the first textbook, the real intercultural communication textbook in 1976, which was about 4 years after the institution of the very first PhD program in intercultural at the University of Minnesota, which is the program I graduated from in 1976, about the same year that first textbook was published. So, when you put these people together, you get intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is not any one person's idea, but it is a pretty definable lineage. That, as I say in the description of this talk, the lineage of cross-cultural psychology would have virtually none of these people in it. The lineage of anthropology would have few of these people in it, and so forth. You know, this is a particular combination, which in the courses that we're doing now at the IDR Academy, we'll talk about as the constructivist approach. That, for the most part, interculturalists are constructivists, whether they think so or not, by virtue of the fact that this lineage largely represents constructivism. These are constructivist thinkers here. A couple of names that I'd add at the bottom down here. George Lakoff, who's a cognitive linguist, he calls himself, one of the great saviors of the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis. Yet most of his current work has been, or much of his current work, has been to sort of resurrect this idea of language and culture, but in the context of embodied metaphor. That he, like Umberto Maturana, are talking about embodiment, well, like Ida Castiglione for that matter, are talking about embodiment as a way of capturing what it means to enact culture, what it means to have the experience of culture and to enact it. It's an act of embodiment. It's not something that, it's not a cerebral act. It doesn't exclude your thinking, but it does so in an embodied way. And if I were to guess at the future of intercultural, I'd say it's moving towards this idea of contextual embodiment as another necessary dimension, along with cultural relativism, for us to explain what's going on when people have an intercultural experience.